Loretta Swit was always the heart of MASH. Fierce on screen, loyal off it. For decades, she smiled through cast reunions, sidestepped rumors, and let fans believe the set was as perfect as it looked. But there was one thing she never said. Not to the press, not to friends, not even when others started telling their side of the story. Because Alan Alda had once pulled her aside and asked her to keep something quiet. And she did, for over 40 years. But now, at 91, she's done protecting the image. Done keeping the truth buried for the sake of someone else's legacy. Because what Alan told her wasn't small. It changed how the cast saw each other. It reshaped how the show ended. And it left Loretta carrying a secret that never should have been hers to hold. She kept it out of loyalty. She stayed silent out of love. But not anymore. Now she's tired of the lies. And what she's finally revealing changes everything we thought we knew about MASH. Alan Alda was the face of MASH. The leader, the peacemaker, the unofficial captain behind the scenes just as much as he was on camera. But what fans never saw was the weight he carried to keep that cast and that legacy intact. And the one person he trusted with that weight was Loretta Swit. The bond between them ran deeper than most fans ever realized. While others came and went, Alda and Swit were there from the early days to the final goodbye. Through contract battles, creative disagreements, and the never-ending pressure to keep the show's tone just right, they leaned on each other. Quietly, consistently, always in step. They didn't make public declarations. They didn't pose for headlines. But if you knew where to look, backstage photos, the way they glanced at each other during cast panels, how often Alda mentioned her in his memoirs, it was clear. They trusted each other more than anyone else on that set. So when something started to fracture the harmony behind the scenes, Alda turned to Loretta. It wasn't dramatic at first, just tension, a sense that things weren't as easy anymore. Some cast members were growing restless. Others were negotiating exit strategies. The scripts were shifting, the tone of the show was getting darker, and the weight of it all began to show in their faces. One afternoon, between scenes, far from the cameras, Alan pulled Loretta aside, and what he told her wasn't gossip. It wasn't about ratings or storylines. It was personal, emotional, and above all, off the record. He asked her to stay silent, not because it was scandalous, but because it was fragile. Something had happened with one of the cast members, something that could have fractured the group if it got out. And while Alda never admitted guilt the way he spoke about it, Loretta knew. This wasn't about protecting the show anymore. It was about protecting himself. She listened, nodded, and said the words she'd keep inside for the next 4 decades. Of course, I won't say a thing. From that moment on, it was no longer just Alan's burden. It was hers too. She carried it through every rap party, every reunion show, every award tribute and anniversary special where smiling faces masked silent distance. No one ever asked her directly. No one suspected, because Loretta Swit was the ultimate professional. Graceful, controlled, loyal. But the truth was she had been asked to choose between truth and friendship, between the public version of MASH that fans adored, and the reality only a handful of them ever saw. And she chose silence. For Alan, for the legacy, for the millions of viewers who needed MASH to be more than just a show. But as the years went on, and more of the cast passed away, Loretta began to wonder, had she made the right choice? Because the secret she kept wasn't hers to begin with. And now, at 91, with little left to lose and everything left to say, she's ready to let it go. Not out of revenge, but because the truth deserves to breathe, even if it's decades late. To the outside world, MASH was the perfect production. It was funny, heartfelt, deeply human, and the cast seemed to love each other just as much off screen as they did on. But behind those olive drab costumes and laugh tracks, something much more complicated was unfolding. The early seasons had been light, sharp, a blend of sitcom timing and subtle commentary. But by the time the show reached its later years, the tone had shifted. The storylines got heavier, the jokes landed softer, and behind the scenes, so did the mood. Alan Alda had more creative control than most people realized. He directed, he wrote, he rewrote, not out of ego, but out of fear that the show would drift into something meaningless if he didn't steer the ship. But with that control came tension. Some cast members started to feel boxed in. Others questioned the new direction. One actor, whose exit shocked fans, left not because of storylines, but because of what was happening off camera. There were whispered complaints about favoritism, about power plays, about Alda becoming too involved, too protective, too insistent that the show follow his vision. For some, it felt like the camaraderie that once defined MASH was being replaced by quiet resentment. Loretta Swit saw all of it. She wasn't someone who stirred trouble. She didn't gossip, but she noticed the changed expressions in the makeup trailer. The curt replies between scenes. The way certain actors stopped showing up early or started leaving quickly after wrap. And through it all, she stayed silent, because she had promised Alan she would. She knew what it was really about. One of the cast members, someone the audience adored, had confronted Alda privately. What was said between them never became public, but the fallout rippled through the set like smoke from a slow-burning fire. People took sides, even if they didn't realize it. Certain characters began to get less screen time. Others were written out altogether. Fans thought it was creative decisions, contracts, budget, the natural evolution of the series. But Loretta knew. One day, she overheard someone on set ask, "Why would they write him out like that? Doesn't make sense." And in that moment, she felt the weight of the secret pressing in. She wanted to say something, to explain, to defend the man who'd been quietly pushed out. But she didn't, because that wasn't the deal. Alan had asked her to let it go, to protect the bigger picture, to keep the legacy intact. And Loretta, being who she was, honored that. Even as the storylines grew darker and the set more divided, she kept showing up, delivering her lines, supporting the shift in tone, never once letting her face betray what she was holding inside. But the truth has a way of lingering, especially when it's never spoken aloud. And as the seasons passed and castmates disappeared, the question grew louder in her mind. Was protecting the image of MASH worth the cost? Because what the world saw was a beloved television family. But what Loretta saw was a fracture no one ever fully repaired. Loretta Swit didn't think much about the promise at first. After all, it was just a conversation, a private exchange between two trusted friends. Something said in confidence during a moment of stress between long hours on set. She agreed to keep it quiet because she believed it would pass, like most behind-the-scenes tensions do. But it didn't pass. The moment stayed with her, not just because of what Alan Alda had confided, but because of what it represented. A shift. A warning that the family she thought she had on MASH was not as unbreakable as it had seemed. In the years that followed, Loretta carried that secret through every chapter of her life. When people praised the cast's chemistry, she nodded politely. When fans asked why certain actors left the show so abruptly, she gave the rehearsed answers. Creative differences. Looking for new challenges. It was time. But behind her eyes, something flickered. There were times she thought about telling the truth. Times when others spoke out, when Wayne Rogers offered his own account of why he left, or when whispers about on-set favoritism made their way into tabloids. Each time, Loretta stayed quiet, because that's what she had promised to do, and because she knew, once it was out, it couldn't be undone. What she didn't expect was how deeply the silence would burrow into her own life, how it would color the way she looked back on the show, how it would shape her memories, not with joy, but with restraint. At award ceremonies and anniversary specials, she'd sit next to Alda, smile for the cameras, and speak lovingly about the experience. But somewhere deep inside, there was always a hesitation, a pause, a part of her that couldn't forget what had really happened behind the scenes. She felt it most during the quiet moments, watching reruns late at night, flipping through old photos, seeing the faces of castmates who had long since passed, and knowing some of them never got to tell their version of the story, because of her silence, because of her promise. And yet, what choice did she really have? To betray Alan Alda, someone who had trusted her more than anyone else on that set? To break the illusion for millions of fans who still clung to the show as a symbol of comfort, family, and healing? It didn't seem worth it. Not then. But time has a way of changing things. And as the years went on, as the cast grew smaller, and the world moved on, Loretta began to feel something shift. The loyalty that once held her silence in place began to feel less like love, and more like guilt. Not because she had lied, but because she had let others believe something that wasn't fully true. She started to see the legacy of MASH not just as a triumph, but as a half-told story. One shaped by edits, omissions, and secrets no one was supposed to know. And she began to wonder if protecting that version of the truth had been a mistake. Because the cost of silence wasn't just hers. It belonged to every cast member who left misunderstood. To every fan who believed the story they were sold. And to the truth itself. Still sitting in the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it to light. Now, at 91, Loretta is done carrying it alone. At 91, Loretta Swit has nothing left to prove. She's earned her place in television history. Her performance as Major Margaret Hot Lips Houlihan defined a generation. But time has a way of shifting the ground beneath us, and with nearly everyone from the MASH family gone or aging, something inside her began to stir. The silence that once felt protective now felt like a prison. It wasn't about revenge, or anger, or rewriting the past. It was about peace, about making sure the story of MASH, and the people who lived it, wasn't reduced to a highlight reel of smiling faces and gold-plated soundbites, because it hadn't been perfect. And Loretta Swit had known that longer than anyone. She had waited for years, hoping maybe someone else would come forward, that maybe Alan would speak, or someone else would hint at the real tension, the real fracture that shifted the entire course of the show. But no one did, and as time passed, the silence only grew more deafening. So now she's breaking it herself, not with anger, but with clarity. With the kind of calm honesty that only comes after a lifetime of carrying someone else's truth. She doesn't name names. She doesn't point fingers. But her message is unmistakable. MASH was beautiful, yes, but it was also painful. And at the center of that pain was a moment she was asked to bury. A moment that cost her more than anyone realized. What finally pushed her to speak wasn't a book deal. It wasn't a documentary. It was something far simpler. A letter from a fan. Someone in their 60s who wrote that MASH had gotten them through a war. That they'd watched it in a hospital ward, waiting for surgeries. That the show's humor and humanity had saved their life. And in that letter was one quiet sentence that hit her like a wave. You all seemed so close. Like family. That was the version Loretta had helped protect. The one fans believed in. The one she thought was worth shielding. But reading those words, knowing what she knew, she felt something inside her break. Because the truth was, they weren't all that close. Not anymore. Not after that one secret was passed from Alan to her, and never spoken of again. She realized then, protecting the story was no longer serving anyone. Not her. Not the cast. Not even the fans. And so, for the first time, she started to speak. Not all at once. Not on a big stage. But quietly, deliberately to people who had followed her career. People who asked the right questions. Who knew that sometimes the real stories never made it into the reunion specials. She talked about regret. About what it feels like to hold someone else's silence for decades. About the toll it takes on your memories. On your ability to separate what was real from what was rehearsed. She didn't blame Alan Alda. In fact, she still respects him. She understands why he asked her to keep it quiet. Maybe he was protecting someone. Maybe he thought it would all blow over, but it didn't. And now, all these years later, Loretta has come to believe that protecting the image cost them something far more valuable than ratings or reputation. It cost them the full truth, and that's what she's finally ready to give back. So what was the secret Alan Alda asked Loretta Swit to keep? After all these years, she still won't spell it out word for word. Not because she's afraid, but because she knows some truths cut deeper when left between the lines. But if you listen closely, if you read between the pauses, the tone, the slight shift in her voice when the subject turns to the final seasons of MASH. You'll feel the shape of it. It wasn't scandal. It wasn't betrayal. It was something far more human. Someone, perhaps a cast member, perhaps a director, perhaps Alda himself, had said or done something that fractured the trust between people who once saw each other as family. And rather than confront it publicly or risk the illusion breaking, Alda asked Loretta to help him protect the version of events the world would accept. The story that would go down in history, and she agreed. She helped steer that story for over 4 decades. But now, looking back, she realizes that silence changed things. Because while the show ended on a high note for fans, millions watching, critics applauding, behind the scenes, there were people who left hurt. People who felt erased, rewritten, or pushed out for reasons the public never knew. She says it now in simpler terms. There were people who didn't get the goodbye they deserved. She's not just talking about the finale episode. She's talking about real goodbyes, real moments that were swept aside to keep the peace, departures that were explained away with polished press statements, while the truth stayed locked in dressing rooms and call sheets. Loretta reveals that toward the end of the show's run, not everyone felt welcome anymore. That decisions were made without the whole cast's input. That creative control wasn't as democratic as the public believed. And the secret? It was about what Alan had to do to keep the show on course. About how he handled someone who disagreed with him. Someone who challenged his growing control. Someone who was quietly removed. Loretta understood the pressure he was under. She knew he loved the show and wanted to protect it. But that decision, whatever form it took, had consequences. Emotional ones. And when he asked her to stay silent, she did. Now, she speaks not to cast blame, but to bring context. To show that MASH wasn't immune to the same power struggles and quiet heartbreaks that touch every workplace, even the most beloved ones. Why does it matter now? Because fans deserve to understand the full picture. Because the people who left, whose exits were never properly explained, were part of what made MASH great. And because pretending everything was perfect does a disservice to the complexity of what they built. Loretta isn't bitter. She's just older now, and finally honest about the weight of that silence. She still cares for Alan Alda. She still cherishes the memories. But she also knows that protecting the legacy doesn't mean rewriting it. It means telling the whole truth, even if it hurts, even if it's late, even if no one else is left to confirm it. Because silence might preserve an image, but only truth preserves meaning. For more of the latest news and stories, check out this video.